now. Hi, folks. We're just giving everyone a few seconds to get logged in before we get started here.
Everything. Okay, there we go.
If you are already logged in, you can open up chat to find information about how to buy tonight's featured book and how to get 15% off when you buy through Greenlight's website in the next week. All right, good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. We're excited to host tonight's event with Katherine Hill, presenting her new book, A Short Move. She'll be talking with René Steinke, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to everyone for making this happen and to all of you for showing up. Greenlight storefronts are currently closed, but our community is still here, and we're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things. You can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see your name over in our attendee list, and when you comment in chat or ask questions in our audience Q&A. There are a couple of Zoom functions we'll be using throughout our event that you'll see if you scroll over the bottom of your Zoom window. One is labeled chat. You can comment here throughout the event, say hello to the authors, comment on what they're talking about to them or to your fellow attendees, and provide some applause after the reading or during high points in tonight's conversation. You'll also see an icon down there labeled Q&A. This is where we'll be pulling questions from during the audience and Q&A portion towards the end of our event. You can type questions in there at any point throughout tonight's conversation. And if you see another attendee's question that you would really like to hear answered, you can go ahead and upvote that. And the questions with the most likes will float towards the top of our queue as we're pulling questions to ask Katherine. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our website and social channels later on. Tonight's featured book, A Short Move, is available for sale from greenlightbookstore.com. Though our stores are closed, we're working with our supplier warehouse for fast direct-to-home shipping. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. We're offering 15% off on the featured book when you purchase it from Greenlight's website in the next week, so look for that coupon code in the chat. Our interviewer for this evening is René Steinke. She is the author of 3 novels, The Fires, Holy Skirts, and most recently, Friendswood, which was named one of National Public Radio's Great Reads of 2014, and described as a large-hearted, big-brained book by Darren Strauss. Her essays and book reviews have appeared in the New York Times, Vogue, O Magazine, Book Forum, and in anthologies, and she's the recipient of a 2016 Guggenheim Fellowship. She's currently the director of the MFA program in creative writing at Fairleigh Dickinson University, and she lives in Brooklyn. She'll be speaking with our featured author, Katherine Hill. She's the author of the novel The Violet Hour and co-author of the Ferrante Letters, an experiment in collective criticism. Her fiction, essays, and reviews have appeared in numerous publications, including Book Forum, The Guardian, In Plus One, The Nation, San Francisco Chronicle, and Tin House, among others. She's an assistant professor of English at Adelphi University, and her writing has been awarded fellowships from the New York Public Library, Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and the Corporation of Yaddo. Born in Washington, D.C., she now lives with her husband and daughter in Brooklyn. Her new book, A Short Move, follows football star Mitch Wilkins, laying tragically and painfully bare the sacrifices necessary for success in sports and in attaining the American dream. Katherine is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she'll be talking with René and with all of you. Katherine, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. So this is my first and maybe only reading for this book. So I just want to make sure that I give thanks where thanks are due. Thank you so much, Greenlight, for hosting this event and allowing people to gather in this virtual space from around the country and maybe even around the world, I'm not sure. Thank you to my agent, Jim Rutman, who fought for this book from the beginning, to Robert Lasner and Elizabeth Clemenson of IG, who brought it into the world, and to René for hosting this reading and conversation, which I'm really excited about. These past few weeks, I've heard from so many friends and relations and colleagues and former students, many of whom I think might be watching now. And it's really been incredibly moving in such troubled times to feel so supported by my community and to imagine you all here with me in this one big imaginary room. So thank you for being here. I am picturing your faces, even though I can't see them. So with that said, I'm going to read from the very, very beginning of this book, which is a chapter set before our protagonist's birth. It is narrated, or it's in the voice of, I suppose you could say, from the perspective of his father. And the nice thing about doing this is I don't need to give you any preamble, just go straight in. Chapter 1, Joe, 1971. 8 months before the legendary linebacker Mitch Wilkins was born, his father Joe stood at the edge of the Briarwood College pasture, gazing at a huddle of black and white cows. Joe had left his jacket at his girlfriend Cindy's, and he was cold, though apparently the cows, those living radiators, were not. Even from his distance, he thought he could see the heat rising from their backs. He whistled a little, trying to get their attention. When the right one looked at him, say, the near one in perfect silhouette, he'd go to Cindy, explain about the ring, and ask her if she'd have him anyway. He didn't know what he'd do if one of the other cows looked, the ones with their bony butts to him, or the ones already kind of facing his way. Try again, maybe, with a different cow? He whistled again, louder this time, and the next thing he knew, the cows were all stock still, but in slightly different positions, a head here, a belly there. He registered some noses, and above each, a pair of big, bored eyes, and yet it was impossible to say if any of these faces belonged to his original cow. He'd blacked out, missed the crucial shift. Perhaps he'd even missed it twice. And with this realization, he found himself seized with panic. He was 19 and staring at cows. He had no jacket, no engagement ring, and no idea how he'd messed up so bad. Part of him wanted to blame his brothers. Rob, the oldest, with the chin scar and the hippo hands. Tim, the veiny one, younger by a year, shorter by an inch, and true to all lazy assumptions, more pugnacious by a mile. They'd always been a trio with him, the Wild Williams boys. But then, out of nowhere, the older two broke ranks, voluntarily deploying to Vietnam when Joe was still in high school. Everything fell apart after that. His dad seemed to be drunk more often, even in the mornings, and his mom slowed down, then simply stopped cleaning the house. Next thing Joe knew, she had breast cancer and a forecast of 6 months to live. He coped by throwing himself into his final season of Monacan County High School football and Monacan County high school parties. His dad coped by trying to get Joe a college scholarship, a scheme that involved a lot of loud, beer-battered phone calls and one sideline chat with a suit-wearing scout, whose gospel Joe actually allowed himself to believe. In the end, despite a solid senior season, Joe graduated with 0 scholarship offers. Then his mom died, leaving him all alone with an increasingly belligerent dad and no brothers around to tell him what to do. He really could have used them in his present situation, especially Robbie, who didn't get mad like Tim. The present situation was that Cindy was pregnant. Cindy, who was so new to Joe, she'd never even met his mom, and so studious and respectable, she'd barely met his friends, even though they'd all gone to school together all their lives. And she'd played volleyball, walking the halls in her shorts and high socks. He'd noticed her then. How could he not notice an extravagantly tall and pigtailed creature like Cindy Wilkins? But he'd been too hamstrung by stereotypes. She was a good girl, he was a degenerate, that he mostly pretended to ignore her. All that went out the window after his mom died, and he was feeling raw and open to anything, especially to women who seemed healthy and good. And it was in this frame of mind that he ran into Cindy at a bonfire, and she turned out to be exactly his type, confident in herself and surprisingly eager to fool around. Just like that, she forced him to reevaluate his understanding of goodness, and by extension, his understanding of himself. Maybe he didn't have to be a degenerate. Maybe he could be his own type. But then came her pregnancy, and with it, another reevaluation. You're going to run now, she said, aren't you? Stung, he promised to marry her that very night, while she, in all her decency, tried to talk him out of it, saying, "Don't be hasty, marriage isn't a game. I'm not telling you to pressure you, maybe you're not done being wild." But what the hell else was he supposed to do with such serious information? He rushed home, which was by now a genuine junk box of a living situation, cluttered with his old man's empty beer bottles and half-eaten containers of food, not to mention towers of unread newspapers, used tissues, and suspiciously smeared man briefs to claim the one thing his mother had left him, her engagement ring. His dad was in his usual spot, passed out on the couch, which gave Joe a clear lane to the stairs. What wasn't choked with dust was sticky and crawling with fruit flies, and the entire house smelled tuberish, a mixture of exfoliated skin and fart and the sour tang of days-old booze. But amid the master bedroom mess, his mom's ring was still there, in its faded velvet box, gold band, diamond crown, a tiny piece of indestructibility. He held it in his hand and thought maybe everything would be all right. It was a short-lived happiness, because the next thing he knew, his father was awake and before him, already ranting, demanding to know what the hell was going on. In recent months, he'd been harder on Joe than ever, though Joe had never shown more direction, hauling peat, planting shrubs, clearing branches, and generally disposing of the natural debris that menaced the prim grounds of Briarwood College, where his dad ran the physical plant. He loved the sweat, the muscle groups firing, the little kid thrill of sticking his hands into dirt, and he loved bringing home milk from the dairy. What he didn't love was coming home to his father, who devoted his downtime to heavy drinking, ruthless criticism, and goading Joe into useless fights. The old man was spry for a congenital alcoholic, could get a good grip, every now and then wriggle out of a hold. But Joe's reflexes were sharper, his balance better, his brain not made of mush. He pinned his father every time, lightly held him down, kicking and yelling until the old man just ran out of gas, which was exactly what happened again that night, when he came upstairs to find Joe, taking priceless things without asking. Except this time, Joe was so buzzed on his sudden new future, so certain the ring was rightfully his, and so finally fed up with his father's distortions, the catastrophe of his inflated belly, the aftershock of his bloodshot eyes, his empty speechifying and his human smell, all the beers he drank while his wife lay dying, all the petty and regular ways he had of making Joe feel stupid and small, that he might have overdone it, thrown a real punch or two, and finished off with some personal accusations that reduced the old man to tears. And to top it off, after Joe finally disentangled himself and got the hell out of that miserable house, he discovered, driving in darkness back to Cindy's, digging into his pocket with one hand, the other loosely guiding the wheel, that he hadn't even managed to hold on to the ring, that he'd sought it and fought for it and won it, and then he'd lost it, slipped from his hand in the scuffle, or maybe dropped in the grass on the long way out. "Come on," he called to the college pasture, where he'd finally pulled over around 1 a.m., too disgusted with himself to face Cindy just yet, and where he'd awoken that morning in his car, his neck bent almost to his chest, his body rigid from trying to clench in its heat. He leaned into the fence post, desperate for a decision. The one on the middle left in perfect profile. That was his new magic cow. He knew he ought to quit playing and just go to Cindy. What did she care about the ring? He'd buy her a better one later, and while he saved up for it, they could live with her parents. A sort of helpless but honorable pair. Mrs. Wilkins on disability from arthritis, Mr. Wilkins without an arm from World War II. It wouldn't be so bad. Her bedroom even had a private entrance. But the problem, he was beginning to understand, was bigger than the ring. Say he married her and they had a son. Say he spent every day in a tidy house teaching that kid how to treat people. Didn't even make him play football, but didn't stop him either, if that's what the kid wanted to do. Say his brothers came home and raised families of their own, and in the meantime, Joe completely turned himself around, got 1,000,000 degrees, and became a doctor or something. Even then, there'd be blind spots, gaps in coverage, things he plainly couldn't control. And whatever his situation, he'd still be himself, the degenerate son of his own failed father. Try as he might, he couldn't reason his way out of that one. A cow was approaching him now, with surprising velocity, like a time-lapse film of the cow's whole day. She stood before him, a woolly tank with a nose like a giant rubber pad, and ears that fired straight from her head. Finally, it was almost uncanny, after all that time she'd spent standing around. He placed a hand on her neck, and she tolerated it, even seemed to authorize a transfer of warmth. In that moment of weird skin-to-skin contact, he had a memory of being a kid on his dad's shoulders, back when his dad was muscular and fast. Together, they were the Monacan maniac, the strongest man that ever lived. They tore through the yard like that, stalking Joe's terrorized brothers, especially Tim, the spiteful middle one, who always made a point of pinning Joe. He remembered his legs hugging his father's neck, his father's hands cupping his ankles, so that Joe could be the big one for a change, so that Joe could sense in the grown man beneath him all the power his body would one day contain. His father had done his best for him, he could see that, but it hadn't made much difference. Because how much bigger was he now, and how much better? If he could stand there as long as he had, touching the cow, the one he supposedly sought, the one that meant it was time to go to Cindy, and already know that Cindy had been right, that he was scared and he wasn't going to marry her, because he barely knew her and he'd rather be wild, because the main thing his body contained, and would no doubt contain for the rest of his life, was nothing but an urgent and genetic need to punish his child, to be like his father, to be like his brothers, to ruin the good things, to run. Thank you. So now we can talk about lighter things.
Thank you. Thank you for that beautiful reading, Katherine.
Thanks,
And
René.
congratulations on this ambitious and amazing book.
Thank you.
I feel like, has anyone held it up yet?
Oh yeah, here it is.
It's just a short move to cover. And thank you, Greenlight Bookstore, I'm really honored to be here with my friend Katherine, fellow writer. So I grew up in small town Texas, where football is everything. And you and I have talked about how we share this love of the sport, especially its characters. And also, I don't exactly know how to say this, but its beauty.
Yeah.
And you capture that so well in this novel. Just the sheer aesthetic pleasure of the game, and also for Mitch, like what it feels like to be inside the game. And you know, my love of football is imprinted on me from childhood and high school, and then it kind of stopped. But yours continued. You have this fascination that's sort of abiding. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how and why football inspires you.
Yeah. So like you, I spent a lot of my childhood in a football town, Amherst, Virginia. And I think the high school team won the state championship right after I moved, but around that time. So it was like, you know, football was like one of the main events in town. But even before that, I had spent a lot of time with my parents watching football on television. So we were, you know, big Navy fans. My dad taught at the Naval Academy for most of his career. And so we watched the Army-Navy game every year, and also a lot of Navy games throughout the season. But then in Virginia, you know, it really became, it became even bigger for me, I think. I was a middle school cheerleader, and there were two squads. There was the football squad and the basketball squad. And I really wanted to be on the football squad, partly because I loved watching the game. Also because we had more space to do our thing, which was really important to me. But so yeah, it's always been a sport that's fascinated me. I think partly because, I mean, it's the perfect sport for television, you know, the field is beautifully framed on TV. You can actually see the patterns from the kind of bird's eye view that the camera gives you. And yet the players feel very distant as a result of that. So I've always been, and I'm a people person, I've always been really curious about the people in those uniforms, you know, behind those masks. It's one of the few sports where you just almost never, it's really rare to see a face, especially on the field when they're playing. You get the sideline shots here and there, but during the games, you know, there's a kind of invisibility even as you're looking right at the players. So I've been very curious about the players' experience for a very long time, I think, as a result of all of that. That kind of gets at your question.
Yeah, yeah. And this is a novel about football,
Yeah.
but it's of course about a lot of other things too.
Yeah.
And it's not by any means the typical sports novel. It's not like, you know, underdog team makes good, or, you know, against all odds, this athlete makes it. You're subverting a lot of those narratives. And because of that, you're able to talk about so much more. You're kind of talking about football as capitalism. You talk about, I mean, there's a way in which this is a feminist novel. There's a, you know, what does football mean to the women who are around Mitch? how does football affect friendships, and many other things. So football becomes kind of a lens to look at so many other things in America, which I think is really brilliant.
Oh.
And one of the reasons why that works is because of the structure you chose. And I wondered if you could talk, it's a pretty unique structure. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about why you chose to structure the book the way you did, and how that allowed you to talk about so much more than a kind of typical sports narrative.
Thank you. Yeah, that's so kind. Yeah, it's funny, the sports story is a kind of tried and tested genre, that gets played out in journalism, but also, in fictional representations too. And yeah, there's always that underdog story. We follow someone trying to make a team, or we follow a team trying to win a championship. And in some ways, entering that space meant that I had to kind of like shrug off all of those sort of stereotypical plots, but it also gave me a lot of freedom, because I thought, okay, the reader can assume all that. The reader can assume that there are these kind of, highs and lows to a season. And what I could do is kind of focus on the non-events in a way, the sort of, which I actually think are events, are the events that I'm most interested in, the behind the scenes, the kind of, the way slow, the way processes build to make us into the people that we are without even really noticing. So this novel is, is episodic, deliberately so in nature. It almost is a kind of a collection of stories as much as it is a novel. There are gaps in time between each chapter that don't get fully filled in. The reader has to supply that. And there's a lot of changes in perspective. So we hear from so many different people in Mitch's life, primarily in his family and in among the people closest to him. So a teammate as well, and his daughter, his wife, his mother, his father. That was all really important to me, because that's the stuff that you don't get to see if you're a fan of the sport, right? And that is often actually deliberately hidden. And so that actually is kind of what I wanted to center the book on, the emotional relationships, the psychological experience of being a person who happens to play football and has a whole lot of other things to deal with in his life as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the things I love about this novel is the way you really get a sense of what it's like to be inside Mitch's body, Mitch, the football star's body, both his athletic prowess, but also, as the book goes on, what it feels like to be in a decaying body, or a body that's can't do all the things that it used to do. And you take a lot of care with that. How important was that to your imagination of the story? And I guess one of the questions for me in the book is, does Mitch's body belong to him, or does it belong to other people?
Yeah, I love that question. Yeah, that was a huge part of the attraction of this story to me. For one thing, he's such a different person for me, right? He's physically extremely powerful, which I am not. He's male, right? With all the baggage and that comes along with that. And so it was really a pleasure to really try to kind of almost, put on that costume, right? To try to imagine what it would be like to operate machinery like that, so that was certainly a big part of it. I met the character for the first time in a short story that I wrote about 10 years ago now about his daughter when she's in college and drops out and works in retail. And he was just kind of this minor character in the background, but already retired from the NFL and already kind of dealing with some of those issues with his, his body starting to decline, his memory starting to fade. And so I knew from the very beginning, once I realized, I want to write about him, I want to actually build a book around him, I knew from the beginning that I would be addressing his decline as much as his glory years, right? And the decline actually became most fascinating to me, I think, because it happens at such an early age for athletes. There's this kind of old man thing that happens in your 30s. when, you know, for the rest of us who don't do punishing physical work for a living is like kind of prime, right? It's like when you're just starting to maybe attain some sense of mastery, you know, or at least for me, that was how it felt. So that was a really interesting juxtaposition with my own experience, to think about what it would be like to be done with the thing that you had been working towards your whole life at you know, in your mid to late 30s. And yeah, does his body belong to him? I just think that is the kind of the question of the book. You know, it belongs to his work. Certainly it belongs to the team, the owner of the team in a way. But it belongs to his teammates too, because they have to literally protect each other out there. And it certainly belongs to his family, you know, to his, you know, his partners, his children. And he and his body both mean different things to all of those people. And I think that is sort of part of the athlete's experience generally, that the athlete means so many different things to so many different viewers. And I did really want to capture that without being too obvious about it.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about what it was like to, you know, so fully inhabit a male perspective for much of the book? I mean, especially in this sort of masculine sport of football. Yeah. I told you that I was once a few years ago, I was on a panel, and the moderator asked me about my thoughts about writing from a male perspective, and all of the other women on the panel said I would never do it. I would never do it because it would be too scary. And I thought that was shocking, because of course we've read millions of, maybe not millions, but we've read lots of men writing from female perspectives in our upbringing. So did it feel like a bold move to you, or did it just feel like this is what a writer does? I should be able to imagine a male perspective.
Yeah, I think the latter. Honestly, it did not keep me up at night at all. That decision. If anything, it was really exciting. You know, it was like, here's an opportunity to learn about an experience that I have some familiarity with, you know, for sure. I know some men, you know, I know some football players even, but to really, but to, you know, learn and imagine so much more. And I think the kinds of subjects that attract me as a writer are subjects that I feel, you know, sort of drawn to for reasons I can't explain. Like I want to be around that subject in some way, but also that I just really don't understand, you know, that kind of confuse me. And so I think I think in this case, football and the kind of physically aggressive male experience certainly served that purpose. It was really, really interesting to imagine, you know, being someone who solves problems physically, you know, rather than mentally or emotionally. So, yeah.
I'm wondering how much Friday Night Lights, the book, was an influence in this novel, because so much about in that book, you really get to know characters and how they fit into the community. And that you've sort of taken that idea to to the nth degree in the structure of this book, and in the way that you're moving around and looking at all the people who surround Mitch.
Yeah, I guess I probably read that book once I'd already started this one and had my my plan already, which is basically what I stuck to. Yeah, I knew I sort of knew that I was going to tell a full life story. That was really important to me. Once I realized that kind of the irony of being Mitch being an old man already in his 30s, I realized I wanted to trace out the full life trajectory with its incredibly speedy start, and then that kind of slow coda. So I must have read that book, at some point once I'd already kind of mapped it out. But it was meaningful. I have to say the show was probably more meaningful. The show really got me through some crazy years. It became like an old friend, very familiar. I've watched it more than once. I have there the Tammy Taylor with the wine gif is a fave. So that show, it's sort of romance, but also its willingness to address the full community surrounding football was something that I admired for sure.
Yeah,
sure. It's sort of like the raw footage quality to it too. Like it kind of pretends to be documentary, I think, in its form, in its style. And I, as a fiction writer, really like that. I like when fiction, sort of the analog in fiction, I guess, would be when the prose feels like it's sort of just like directly relayed in an unmediated way, just like coming straight at you from the character's mind. So that stylistically, I think it informed me as well.
I mean, that basically is my hometown.
Right?
It is a documentary as far as I'm concerned.
Totally.
Totally. So I have some more questions, but I wonder if we should open this up to some of your fans who are here. So why don't we open it up, and then if there's I'll jump in if there's not more questions. I think, let's see, are these on the?
I think they're in
okay. Here's a great question. Who's your favorite Friday Night Lights character from the show?
Yeah, that's so hard. It's really hard. I mean, like, Tim Riggins. Like, it's really, I mean, the hair. He's such a house cat, like he just wants to be in love. He's not, he subverts that kind of masculine stereotype so beautifully, even as he shows up in the beginning of the show, and you think he's going to be, the douchebag. But no, I love all of that. I love all the characters. My husband's shouting in the car. He's like, "Smash!" Yeah, I love Smash too. Yeah, for sure. Actually, we just really recently watched the Dickinson show on Apple TV, which I think is amazing, and I highly recommend. And it was very delightful to see Luke Cafferty show up in that show. He was from like one of the later seasons. Anyway, I love all the people on the show.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, me too. Let's see. Let's see. Can you talk about your writing process? Do you outline? Do you do dramatic revisions across drafts?
Yeah, that's great. I think it changes with each project, but with this one, I began it like really high on the completion of the first novel. It's my second book, and I had finished the first one and felt like I climbed to the mountaintop and like I knew how to do this. Like I'll just do it again, like no problem. And the lesson I learned from that one was I needed to outline. So I plotted out really the trajectory of Mitch's life, leaving out, again, a lot of the big events, trying to center it on the stuff that is usually left off the page. And then, I usually try to proceed for the two books now that I've written, I try to proceed from beginning to end. And until I feel like I have a full draft. Though with this book, because of the episodic quality, I was actually able to write it out of order, which I did not do the first time. So I started with that story that is his daughter as a college student. And then the next piece I wrote was about Mitch himself when he was roughly the same age, when he was 18. And those became sort of like the two nodes that I spun the outline out from. I wrote things in all different order, basically like whichever character I felt ready to tackle or felt kind of most curious about, usually because I met them in a smaller way in the part I just finished, then I went to that section. So that made writing this book really, really fun. I felt like I was just expanding the universe, but going deeper with every step. And then it had to be revised like 1,000 times. I had to have many very, very generous people read it at different stages. And new chapters emerged from the feedback that I got from those conversations. So it was a 7-year process in both cases. That seems to be my magic number. Like maybe 6 years of writing and 1 year of, publication, like final round editing. So it's hard. I think that basically answers it. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Okay, let's see what we have. Are there any books you read while writing this book that were especially helpful or inspiring?
Yeah. It's funny because this is, it's a book about football, which most of us encounter through the medium of television, or live performance, I guess you could say. So obviously those experiences, like, you know, memories of seeing TV and then rewatching some TV were very informative. But I'm a writer, so I also had to go to books, right? Like I was writing a book. And most books about football are a different genre, right? They're journalism or they're memoir. So I was aware that I was basically, you know, I was doing something so different that it might as well be, you know, poetry or visual art. You know, it wasn't journalism, but though it was narrative. But I still really wanted to get some of the kind of standard narratives in my head, and some of the, you know, sporty voices in my head. So I read a couple memoirs that I really loved. Warren Sapp's Sap Attack is amazing, which it just, you know, the title says it all, I think. It's just the voice is so charming and kind of crazy, and it really makes you feel like it's a guy telling you his life story. So I found that really helpful. And there's also Tony Siragusa's memoir, Goose, which had a similar effect. And then there were several journalistic chronicles of whole seasons, which was really helpful because that, you know, football has that built narrative already. Every sport does, right? It has its season from, you know, off-season training all the way through to the eventual potential championship. So I wanted to read some narrative accounts of that too. There's a really good book by Nicholas Davidoff called Collision Low Crossers, about the Jets in, I don't know, somewhere in the Rex Ryan era. And then there were a couple others that were really helpful, but that one's my favorite.
Let's see.
Oh, but I should say, actually, the books that matter more, I realize I'm just like football. The books that actually matter the most are literary fiction, right? Because that's my form. So A Visit from the Goon Squad is a book that was super, super important to me. I read it really right before I started this project, and it kind of opened my eyes to a different way of structuring a novel than the kind of what I thought of as kind of the more conventional contemporary style. So that book, for those of you who don't know, is basically a novel in stories. There's a central character, so it's like sort of one or two central characters, but you wouldn't know that necessarily because each story really takes you into a radically different point of view, and in different places and different times, and it's not even linear. You know, we jump around in time fully, and so by the time we get to the end, you kind of have a sense of how time has passed for these people, but it hasn't happened in a linear fashion. So that was so thrilling to me. I was so sad when that book ended, and I thought I wanted to do something similar with gaps and playing with time that way, to what Jennifer Egan did. So that's maybe one of the most important books. And then 7 Up, the documentary too, which checks in with a group of British children who were born in the late 40s, maybe early 50s, every 7 years. And it's Michael Apted directed it. It's so fabulous. And you can watch like the most recent one and get a kind of, it'll fill you in on what's happened to all of the people over the course of their lives, but it's so much more interesting to watch each one as they come out. And you really see these sort of radical changes in people's lives over the course of 7 years. Yet they remain sort of essentially themselves. And I'm so fascinated by that approach to storytelling. So it definitely informs this book.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me of Boyhood too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That book, and actually the other Linklater films, the Before trilogy, with Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy, Before Sunrise, Before Sunset,
right.
Before Midnight. Again, there's a gap of, I think it's 7 to 8 years, something like that, in between the meetings of these two characters. And the actors have aged literally the exact same amount of time, just like in Boyhood. So yeah, those movies were really, that kind of storytelling was what I was after in this book.
Okay, so I just noticed that, you know, there are votes on some of these questions, and the most popular question I have neglected up to this point. It's a really good question. So now that the book is out of your control, do you miss Mitch? I'm wondering how it feels to let go of your characters.
Oh, I love that question, Billy. Thank you. Yeah, you know, it's funny. I feel right now, I don't know if this is true, will be true for every book, but right now I feel like I've done my best by him, and like it's like I've raised a child or something. Like I don't know, like off he goes, you know. Although unlike a child, I'm not I don't know that I'll maintain a close relationship with him, going forward. Yeah, I'm eager for him to belong to readers now, I think. I think, he'll always feel like he's mine, and and all the characters in this book will feel that way, I think. But maybe partly because it's a life story and I got all the way through it, there's some unturned corners in the middle there, of course, but this feels like an easy kind of Viking funeral to, send him off. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, if everybody hated him, I might feel differently. We'll see. We'll see.
I think this is a really important, good question, and we didn't touch on this yet. So football is a sport with a lot of both white and black players, coaches and fans. You discussed writing male characters as a woman, but did you also approach writing characters of a different racial or ethnic background than yours?
I did, yeah. So, so I met Mitch, this character, who's the center character in that first short story. So I already knew that he would be the heart of it. But, the NFL is 70% African-American, the players. And so authentically, if you're going to tell an authentic story about a life in football, you have to include some level of interracial friendship, interracial workplace relationships. And so that is definitely a big feature of the book. One of the other really, really important characters who has a chapter that's kind of his chapter is a fellow linebacker. Mitch is a middle linebacker, and this is one of his younger teammates named D'Antonio Mars, D, and he is a major character in the book. That was it's a challenge to write outside of one's own experience always, and that sort of was true for basically every single character in this book, and all just in different ways, right? Different challenges, and yeah, I guess race would be one of them for D, for sure.
Let's see, a fellow writer question.
Yeah.
Did the outline or plan for the book change while you were writing it, or is the final book essentially faithful to that first outline? So you said you did a lot of drafts, but did the order of things change? Did the structure change?
Yeah, I think, some things moved around, but because the structure is radical in the sense that it's like deliberately linear. Like, we don't jump back in time ever, which is a really common feature of contemporary fiction, I think. You have someone in a present moment, and then they're often dipping back in time to kind of fill you in on how they got there in some way. The narrative is doing that. And in this case, characters think about the past. The progress of the narrative is always moving forward, which I liked the kind of resonance with football for that kind of the emphasis on forward motion, right? You always have to keep moving forward. And so any chapters that came in after that initial outline had to be slotted into their right place in the chronology.
Mm-hmm.
That did happen. There were a few that came up that found their way into the book after the first draft. But the overall shape, I think, and then I guess I think I might have cut some, it's been so long. It's been so long, and it's hard to remember which was the first draft versus like the third or the fourth.
Yeah.
I had a weird frame at one point that I chopped off. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had a frame. I had a different opening at one point. Well, that's fun to remember. Thanks for that question. I'm glad I chopped that off. I really like starting with Joe.
The opening is stunning. That's the right opening for sure.
Thank you.
Let's see. This is a good one from Anonymous. Can you talk about Mitch and his mom's relationship?
Yeah. So you met Mitch's mom briefly in that section that I read, Cindy Wilkins, and you if you're like a crazy careful listener, you might have noticed that he has his mom's last name, not his dad's, which, if you're a sleuth, you might determine, looks like his mom raised him, not his dad. So it's a very close single mother and only child, single son relationship. And she is a character who is with him his whole life, right? And they're devoted to each other in ways that is complicated as parents and children can be. So I loved writing that relationship. She narrates the day of his draft to the NFL, where she is the perspective that we see. It's the third person. And, thinking about her son up for auction, is kind of the main time that we spend with her. So yeah, that's an important relationship in the book. Thank you, Anonymous.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is a good question. Which character did you have the most difficulty inhabiting? And what did you do to then successfully write from their perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the men would be harder than the women on balance. There are more women in the book, interestingly. So it's like Mitch's story, but I kept being drawn back to mothers and daughters.
The women are so important to this book.
It's so important. I mean, they nurture and help shape this person, right? And in some ways they're abandoned by this person. So the women are really the heart of it. But yeah, so I guess it have to be Mitch and Dee, the two really significant male characters. And I guess his uncle. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, each one I just kind of went all in on when I was there with them. When I was working on the section. So it was hard. It's hard to play. It's hard to think comparatively because I wasn't ever writing multiple points of view at once. I was always really focusing on the one, and really trying to do justice to the extent that I could to that one.
Is there anything you did to, in particular, when you struggled with this? Like, did you try to read something specific when you were trying to get into those points of view, or did you? Yeah.
That's a good question. I think, often I would be reading, male voices when working on the male sections, or, in some cases those football books were really helpful. Mm-hmm. The Agassi memoir, Open, was also helpful. Andre Agassi, I mean, it's about tennis, but again, kind of, first person male athlete. Actually, now I'm thinking about it. I didn't have the answer right away, but I actually think his father was the hardest one for me, the one that I just read. Mm-hmm. That chapter went through so many revisions. It was like 30 pages long at one point. And as you heard, the final version is like 7. It's very, very tight. I had so much fun writing the really long version, like really just, getting into it with that character. And then, but it kept tripping me up. I kept feeling like I was exaggerating in some way, or I was avoiding the point or something, or focusing too much on this person who ends up disappearing, right? Mm-hmm. And yet he was so important because his absence is formative to Mitch's sense of self and his experience in life, and the surrogate fathers that he finds, as a result of that absence, are so important to the cultivation of his self. So yeah, I think maybe, not to be all Freudian about it, but, the absent dad, like I had to really think really hard about that perspective, mm-hmm. because it sets so much in motion. Mm-hmm. Right. And the mom too, of course, she actually raises him, and in some ways it's my favorite character. But I don't know, I felt like I could do her justice in a way that I struggled more with Jo. Thank you.
I think we're almost out of time.
Yeah.
Do we have, maybe we have time for one more question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Let's see. Well, this is a fun one to end with, maybe.
Yeah.
Katherine, fill in the blank. The Washington Redskins will next win the Super Bowl in the year blank. Note that I'm not even providing the millennium in which this will happen.
Mean. You know, by the time they win again, they won't be called that. So I think we have to start the whole sentence over. I think we'll be living in a very different world by the time that happens. So that's my refusal to answer that question. That is not the answer. Thank you. I'm sure that was Dave.
I think it was somebody named Kurt.
Oh, Kirk?
Yes.
All right. Thanks, Kirk.
Okay. I think we need to go back over to Greenlight.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Katherine.
Thank you, Renee.
Yeah, thank you, Katherine and Renee, for this wonderful conversation tonight. And thank you to everyone who came out and virtually joined us. A reminder that you can purchase Katherine's book through greenlightbookstore.com. And if you buy through Greenlight's website in the next week, by June 25th, you can get 15% off with the code, I believe it's MOVE. Yes, MOVE. And also, in case you happen to miss any part of tonight's event, or you have friends or family who couldn't make it, it has been recorded, so keep an eye out in the next few days for that on our website and YouTube channel. Thanks so much again, everyone, for holding space for tonight's conversation, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Bye. Congratulations, Katherine.
Thanks.
Yes, congrats.
Thank you. Thank you.